Arratsaldeon Jon Andreok eta ongi etorri Gipuzkoa Talksen 3. solasaldi honetara. Gipuzkoako Foru Aldundiak eta Euskadiko ekonomisten elkargoak elkarrekin antolatu dituzte ekonomiaren etorkizunaren inguruko topaketa hauek eta gaur zikloa amaitu egingo da. El cierre de este ciclo de charlas con las que buscamos claves que nos ayuden a afrontar mejor los retos económicos que tiene nuestro territorio coincide con el foro anual del Colegio Vasco de Economistas y hoy además con un invitado de excepciones, el Premio Nobel de Economía, Joseph Stiglitz, al que damos la bienvenida y saludamos. Thank you very much for being with us today, Mr. Stiglitz, and welcome to Donostia, to San Sebastián. Laizter entzungo dugu, Stiglitz jauna, orain gogoratu gaurko ekitaldiaren hashtaga, GetTalks, eta baita nola ez, galderak egiteko aukera izango duzuela, Joseph Stiglitzi berari galderak egiteko aukera, gipuzkoa.eus/GetTalk elbidean. Aún estáis a tiempo de escribir vuestras preguntas, puesto que la web está abierta ya unos cuantos días abierta para poder formulárselas después de su conferencia Joseph Stiglitz. Y también podéis votar a las preguntas que más os gusten, porque ciertamente ya tenemos unas cuantas, de forma que se coloquen mejor en la parrilla de salida y podamos hacerlas cuanto antes. Etorkizunak ekarriko digunaren zain egon beharrean, Gipuzkoako Aldundiak erronkak identifikatu eta gure etorkizuna guk geuk hainbat eragileren artean elkarrekin eraikitzeko ekimena abian jarri du. Ekimena etorkizuna eraikiz deitzen da eta Markel Olano diputatu nagusiaren eta bere gobernuaren ekimen nagusietako bat da legealdi honetan. Olano jauna, ongi etorri.
Bai, mila esker, arratsaldeon guztioi, eta mila esker baita ere Stiglitz irakasleari gurekin izateagatik. Nik esango nuke labur-labur, gaur biltzen gaituen kontzeptu nagusia eta Stiglitz irakasleak maneiatzen duen kontzeptu nagusia dela desberdintasun soziala. Azkeneko urtetan da krisi sakon horren ondorioz gehiagotzen joan den fenomeno bat mundu osoan zehar, eta desberdintasun hori debate bezala pilpilian daukagu mundu osoan zehar. Eta kontrolik gabeko kapitalismo horrek sortu dituen ondorio horien kontrako ahotsik ozenena ez baldin bada, justu Stiglitz irakaslea izan da eta da. Nik uste dut, berak aukera izango du, gaurkoan izan du eta bihar ere izango du gure artean egoteko, goizpartean egon gera berarekin, eta gure gizarteari buruz, gure sistema sozioekonomikoari buruz galdera asko dindizkigu, beraz interesa nabarmena dauka, eta bihar eskainiko dioguna Mondragon taldea ezagutzeko eta bihar arrasaten izango da. Beraz interes hori adierazi du, eta nik esango nuke desberdintasunaren inguruan behar ditugula guztiok eredu zehatzak. Nondik nola jo, guk gure ekarpena egin diezaiogun desberdintasunaren kontrako borroka horretan. Nik esan behar daukat, nire ustez behintzet, Gipuzkoak bere eredu propioa daukala, Euskal Herriak ere bere eredu propioa daukala, eta hor, asko daukagula hobetzeko, baina emaitzak ere hor daudela. Hor, desberdintasuna neurtzen duten indize nagusietan, hor badago Gini indizea eta S80, S20 indizea daude, eta horietan, iparraldeko herrialde aurreratuenetatik gertu gaude Gipuzkoarrak. Beraz, derriro diot, asko daukagu hobetzeko, baina emaitzak hor daude. Eta gure helburua izango litzateke oraindik ere desberdintasun indize horiek jeistea eta mundu mailan desberdintasun gutxien duen lurralden artean egotea Gipuzkoa. Hori da markatzen dugun helburua. Eta gure sistema sozioekonomikoak bi zutabe nagusi ditu. Bata da ekonomia lehiakor bat eta bigarrena da ongizate sistema aurreratu bat. Eta gainera nik esango nuke Gipuzkoan daukagula aldi berean bi elementu horiekin batera daukagula gizarte sendo bat, gizarte kapital sendo bat, eragile sendo batzuekin. Eta horrek ekarpen berezia egiten diola Gipuzkoaren etorkizunari. Guk uste dugu gizarte sare indartsua edukita ezinbestekoa dela berarekin kooperatzea, erakunde publiko kooperatzea sare horrekin, elkarrekin etorkizuneko erronka nagusiak aurrera ateratzeko eta hoiei behar den bezala aurre egiteko. Horregatik jarri genuen martxan etorkizunareikiz. Etorkizunareikizen nahi duena da, gizartearekin elkarna bultzatu, guk eskuartean dauzkagun erronka nagusiei behar den bezala aurre egiteko elkarrekin. Eta hori egin, esperientzi pilotuen bidez. Guk elkarlana daukagu helburu nagusi, eta nahi dugu baita ere esperientzi pilotuen bidez, mundu mailan dauden esperientzia aurreratuak eta mundu mailan dauden ezagutzak ere aplikatu gurean. Eta horregatik da guretzako privilegio bat eta gaur aukera borobil bat Stiglitz irakaslearen mezuak eta ideiak eta proposamenak entzutea guk ere gurean behar den bezala aplikatzeko. Interesgarria izan dadila guztiontzako jardunaldia. Eskerrik asko.
Eskerrik asko zuri, Olano jauna. Lehen aipatu dugun bezala, G-Talksen, Gipuzkoa Talksen azkenengo hitzordu honek bat egiten du Euskadiko ekonomilariek urtero egiten duten topaketarekin batera. Elkargoaren presidenteari holtzara etortzeko gonbitea egingo diogu oraintxe bertan, Iñaki Ruiz hain zuzen ere, zuri eskatuko dizugu, ez nekien ontzun den, zuri eskatuko dizugu, azaltzeko, mesedez, Josef Stiglitzen ekarpenak ekonomiaren munduan. Ongitorri.
Eskerrik asko denoi, eta lehen esan duen bezala, eskerrik asko foro honetara etortxagatik. El año pasado estábamos aquí en este edificio, en otra sala, con Antón Costas, en el Foro Economistak, y la verdad que estuvimos muy a gusto y desde el propio colegio pues pensábamos ya que con 300 personas que vinisteis, pues ya era un éxito importante aparte del ponente, ¿no? Pero la verdad que, bueno, siempre subestimamos quizás un poco la colaboración y cuando dos entidades como la Diputación Foral de Guipúzcoa y el Colegio Vasco de Economistas se ponen a colaborar, pues se consigue que ese éxito del año pasado se quede pequeño, ¿no? Y que estemos aquí más de 700 personas pues, para escuchar a un ponente. Quizás algo ha tenido que ver que el ponente sea un premio Nobel, ¿no? Eso seguro que también influirá. Antes de presentarle, pues sí quería agradecer a la Diputación Foral de Guipúzcoa y en especial a su máximo representante, Marc Olano, por el trabajo realizado conjuntamente con el equipo del Colegio Vasco de Economistas, porque por eso estamos hoy aquí y por eso está el señor Stiglitz aquí. Joseph Stiglitz es conocido por ser Premio Nobel de Economía en el año 2001. Fue asesor del gobierno de Bill Clinton y estuvo como economista jefe del Banco Mundial en el año 2000. Actualmente es profesor de la Universidad de Columbia y es uno de los grandes estudiosos de la desigualdad social. De hecho, yo creo que es el mayor referente que hay en estos momentos en el mundo. Y también mantiene posiciones ciertamente críticas sobre la globalización. Hoy en la conferencia que nos va a brindar el señor Stiglitz nos hablará de los problemas que genera el desarrollo, de qué pasa con la generación de riqueza y si eso algo tiene que ver con la desigualdad social y cuáles son las diferencias que hay entre los diferentes países, y sobre si el sistema económico y social que tenemos hoy en día pues es un sistema que tiene que seguir siendo válido o quizás hay que retocarlo. No me voy a entretener mucho más porque a quien hemos venido a escuchar, yo también, es al señor Stiglitz, al que doy la bienvenida. So, Mr. Stiglitz, when you want.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's a particularly pleasure because it's nice to be away from the United States. And United States is going through a very bad time right now. And I'll spend a lot of time talking about the United States because it's an example of what not to do. And it's an important example because I think we've gotten things so badly wrong that we provide many lessons for other countries. It's also a particular pleasure for me to be back in the Basque Country again. I've been here a couple of times before. because in many ways, in many areas, you've done some of the things in the right way. I'm a very strong supporter of the cooperative movement, and I think Mondragon is an example for the whole world. I've just been, a few weeks ago, was in Costa Rica, where the cooperative movement is also very strong, and it's another successful place in the emerging middle-income countries. The Basque Country is also important because it's an example of a place where there's been a transition, a transformation of the economy from an old economy, shipyard, steel, to a more 21st century economy. And that kind of transition is extraordinarily difficult. And we fail to do it well. My own city, Gary, Indiana, was a quintessential steel town. It was founded in 1906 as the largest integrated steel mill in the world. It was a company town. In fact, so much of a company town that the name of the city was the name of the chairman of the board of U.S. Steel. You can't be more company town than that. I grew up in the 1950s in what we now know was the golden age of capitalism, the golden age of industrial America. But when I was growing up, it wasn't what I saw. I saw racial discrimination, inequality, conflict between labor and management, strikes, economic volatility, recessions. It didn't seem so great. And that's what motivated me to go from what I had wanted to really do, which is to be a physicist, to becoming an economist. The social problems seemed so strong. But I have to say, 60 years later, things are worse than when I started. I want to describe a little bit of what has gone on and give you an interpretation of why it is going so badly. But this is not just about economics. It's about politics and democracy. Because the economic failures in the United States have set the stage for a political failure. I don't have to talk about fascism in Spain, but we are now facing what I would call a proto-fascist threat from Trump. Many of you may not think it's that bad, but it is. So I'm going to use a lot of charts. I'm going to go through it very quickly, but I think it'll give you a picture of what has gone wrong in the United States. Now, there are four key problems facing almost all of the advanced countries: insecurity, inequality, a sense of lack of voice, a sense of powerlessness of large parts of the population, and a lack of education, at least inadequate education, inadequate to the task of adapting to the new economy. And all of this has led to a lack of hope, a kind of loss of hope and despair, which is understandable, but which has had very big political consequences. Now, this chart shows in a dramatic way what has happened in the United States over the last 40 years, 4 decades, almost a half century. The line at the top, the dotted line going up and up and up, is the average income of the top 10% of the United States. The other curve, the one that looks like, it's the top 1%. It's the average income of the top 1%. The other line that looks like it's the horizontal axis is actually the average income of the bottom 90%. It hasn't changed in 40 years. If you use a microscope, you can see a little bit of an increase. And I haven't doctored the data in any way. I haven't changed the axes. This is all what we call natural numbers, the numbers as they come out. And what they say is that there's been near stagnation for the average income of the bottom 90%, while the top 1% has done very well. Spain is a little better. As you can see, the yellow line at the bottom is the increase in the average income of the bottom 90%, but it is actually stagnated and curved down since the Great Recession, whereas the top did very well until the Great Recession. And more generally, Europe shows a picture very similar to the United States, but just not quite as bad. So we see things clearer in the United States because they are clearer, they are worse. But many of the same patterns are present in Europe as well. Now, it hasn't always been this way. And this chart, which I show for the United States, based on data that Thomas Piketty and his associates have put together based on U.S. income tax data, shows what had been happening until about 1980, 1975. What you see there is the incomes of the top 1% were going down dramatically. In fact, this is a pattern which is so prevalent that Simon Kuznets, who got a Nobel Prize for his work in studying income patterns, it was called Kuznets' law, that in the early stages of development, inequality went up, as some people did better than others, but then in the second stage of development, inequality came down. And the United States and most other countries showed the pattern that I just discussed. And I was growing up in this period of the 1950s and 60s where inequality was at the lowest for a long time. But Kuznets was writing in the 1950s and could not have anticipated what happened beginning in the mid-70s, 1980s. Reagan in the United States, Thatcher in the UK, the notion that you could lower taxes, individual income taxes, corporate income taxes, and you would get more growth and everybody would benefit, that was wrong. And the only thing that was right was that it would lead to more inequality. And it did lead to more inequality, as the diagram shows. Now, there's an idea that many people who argued for these reforms, neoliberalism, that said that lowering taxes, stripping away regulations would incentivize the economy, would free the economy, and the result would be more growth, and everybody would benefit. That was an idea called trickle-down economics. There was no theory behind trickle-down economics, no evidence about it. And now we have a third of a century, more than a third of a century, of evidence that trickle-down economics doesn't work. Market fundamentalism doesn't work, neoliberalism doesn't work. And here is a diagram that showed what happened to the median income, median is half above, half below, of a full-time male worker in the United States. And the full-time male workers are the lucky ones because very large proportions can't get full-time jobs. The full-time male workers in the United States have the same income today that they had some 45 years ago, half a century ago, adjusted for inflation. Can you imagine what it means in a country that is so materialistic and where every generation says you're going to be better than the last generation? For 2 generations, there's been no increase in income of the typical male worker. The same pattern in less dramatic form, again, is true for Europe. And this shows the different countries in Europe, and some it's worse than others. Some countries have done better than others. At the bottom, it's even worse in the United States. The real wages at the bottom in the United States are at the same level today that they were 60 years ago. When I give this kind of a talk in China, they can't believe it. Because 40 years ago, their per capita income was around $150 a year. While America's real income has stagnated, they have moved more than 700 million people out of poverty. And their real incomes have increased 8, 10, 12-fold. Again, the United States is the worst of all the countries, of the advanced countries, but the other countries have not really done spectacularly. But there is something that these figures show, and other figures which I don't have time to show, which is that not all countries have been experiencing an increase in inequality. Some have actually had a decrease. France has managed to avoid the kind of increase in inequality that has gone on in the United States and in most of the other European countries. Some of the Latin American countries, which had very high levels of inequality, have managed actually to reduce them. Brazil, Argentina have all reduced, at least when they had more progressive governments, make significant reductions in inequality. And that's why I argue that inequality is a matter of choice. It's not driven by technology or globalization. Those are global forces. They would affect every country in the advanced world roughly the same. Why is it that the United States has more inequality than Scandinavia? It's because we have different policies. And that is true for the other countries that I mentioned. As we look around the world, actually, global inequality, wealth inequality is even worse than the income inequality that I've just described. In the United States, for instance, in terms of wealth inequality, there are 8 Americans from 2 families who made one important choice. They chose the right parents. And the result of that is that they inherited a lot of money. And so those 8 Americans from the Walton family and the Koch brothers, both of which exercise enormous influence in our politics, have as much wealth as the bottom 1/3 of the country. Globally, things are even worse. Oxfam, which is a very important NGO, does a study every year. And they announce their results at Davos, which is the meeting up in Switzerland where all the wealthy muckety-mucks get together. And they try to convey the sense of inequality that is going on in the world. When they first began their report in 2010, they pointed out that you would need a small fleet of buses, 2 or 3 or 4 buses, carrying 388 people, to have as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the world. In other words, 388 people had as much wealth as 3.8 billion people. Well, the world has gotten more efficient in inequality. So today, in 2017, a small bus with 42 people had as much wealth as the bottom 3.8 billion people. It's testimony to how much wealth there is at the top, but it's also testimony to how little wealth there is at the bottom. Another way of putting it is that 82% of all the growth in global wealth in 2016 went to the top 1%, while the bottom half of the world saw no increase in their wealth at all. And in Spain, the picture is similar to that in much of the rest of the world. The richest 10% hold more than half the country's wealth. There are other dimensions of inequality, and there are two that I want to talk about: health and opportunity. The United States, in contrast to the Basque Country, is a part of in the United States, we don't recognize the basic human right of access to health. And the result of not having a good public health system, giving access to health for everybody, is that the United States, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, actually has a declining life expectancy. Costa Rica, with a per capita income of about a quarter of the United States, has a longer life expectancy than the United States because they have public health. When you look at it more closely, you see that this decline in life expectancy has been particularly great since the beginning of the 2000s, since the last 20 years. This chart shows statistics for what are called mortality. That's the probability that you die rather than how long you live. So when the probability of dying goes up, that's a bad thing. Okay? So this looks at the probability of dying for white males. And the reason we focused on that is some people say, oh, you have a problem in race, you have lots of other problems. We focused, this is work of Ann Case and Angus Deaton. Angus Deaton got the Nobel Prize in 2015. And what it shows, the red line there shows the dramatic increase in the mortality rate, the death rate for white male Americans. If you look at a map of the country, the darker colors there, there's a curve. There are two maps of the United States, one in 2000 and one in 2010. And the darker colors show the places in the United States where there's a higher death rate or a lower life expectancy. The two things that I want to call your attention to is, if you look at 2000 versus 2010, you see the country has gotten much darker. More and more of the country has higher mortality rates, lower life expectancies. But the other thing, if you look in that chart, is the Trump voters are in the areas where people are dying. There's a reason for the correlation. A lot of these deaths are not, there's no epidemic going on in the United States. There's not a disease. We're not talking about a disease that's going around the country, a flu epidemic like in 1917. There's no epidemic going around, except there's a social disease. There's an epidemic of despair. That is what is going on. And what that is leading to is deaths of despair. Deaths related to drug overdose. People are dying in the streets with drug overdose, from alcoholism and from suicide. So the red line there shows the increase in the death rate in the United States from these deaths of despair. And the other curves in that shows what is going on in other countries. None of them have anything like this. Most of them have it going down. Societies are getting better, wealthier. People are sharing their prosperity. But in the United States, these deaths of despair, because there is despair for all the reasons I gave before. And this then is another map that shows what has happened successfully in 4 different periods, 2000, 2007, and then on to later in the, more recently. And what you see is more and more of the country getting browner and browner. These are more and more deaths of despair. And again, what you'll see is a high correlation between the Trump voters and these deaths of despair. Now, one of the things that most people think about America is that it's a land of opportunity. And it is a land of opportunity if you're born rich. The question is, if you're not born rich, is it a land of opportunity? Now, obviously, you can read in the newspaper stories of people who've made it from the bottom to the middle or bottom to the top. But newspapers write about things that don't happen very often. They're newsworthy because they're rare. And so when economists or social scientists say, is America a land of opportunity? What they mean is, what is the probability? What is the likelihood that you make it from the bottom to the top? And the answer is not good. In fact, the life prospects of a young American are more dependent on the income and education of his parents than in almost any other advanced countries. UK is a rival because they've tried to imitate us in our economic model. And that's an important lesson. Countries that try to imitate the United States will wind up with the same kind of results. I mentioned before that inequality is a choice and inequality of opportunity is a choice. It's a result of policies, of what you do. And so what you see in that graph is on the horizontal axis is a measure of inequality of opportunity or equality of opportunity, which is the relationship between the income of the parent and the income of the child. How dependent are the two? And the most equality of opportunity, which is called earnings mobility, are in the Scandinavian countries. There's another thing about that graph that I think is worth noting, and that is the countries with a high degree of equality are also the countries with a high degree of equality of opportunity. One of the reasons the United States has such low level of equality of opportunity is that we have such high levels of inequality. The rungs of the ladder are further and further apart, and when the rungs of the ladder are further and further apart, it's that much harder to move up the ladder. So the idea that of the American dream is a myth, and Americans are gradually beginning to realize that it is a myth. This is a curve that compares different countries in a different way and shows that Spain is sort of in the middle of the pack. It's not as good as the Scandinavian countries, but it's not as bad as the United States. This graph, again, is a map of the United States, which tells you a lot, again, about American politics. Because the dark areas are the areas of the country with no opportunity, with no mobility, where if you're poor, you remain poor. And you notice again the same parts of the country where the death rates are high, life expectancy is low, are the parts of the country where opportunity is low and where there are more deaths, despair. It's the South, it's the Midwest, it's the parts of the country that have not succeeded in making the transition to the 21st century. Now, what I've just given you is some of the data background to try to describe the various dimensions in which things are not going very well in the United States and in many other advanced countries. I now want to spend a little time on the political and the economic consequences, and then finally talk about what can be done about it. It should be obvious that this kind of despair provides ample opportunity for demagogues. They like to blame others. They blame migrants, they blame globalization, they blame elites. The real problem is, as I said, with what we did in the United States, that had we chosen other policies, we would have had different outcomes. You can't blame the migrants, you can't really blame globalization. Sweden is more open, Scandinavia is more open than we are, and has more equality of opportunity, lower levels of inequality. But I do blame the elites, because the elites, and this is true not only in the United States but in other countries, they promised that globalization and liberalization would bring prosperity for all. And the same promise was made with the euro, that it would bring prosperity for all. It hasn't happened. And the failures were predictable and predicted. Globalization was oversold, the benefits were exaggerated, the distributive costs were ignored. For instance, that it weakened the bargaining power of workers. And as I mentioned before, trickle-down economics didn't work, and it almost never has. But I want to emphasize that the demagogues have been aided and abetted by conservatives, by the business communities, by what's sometimes called the moderate right, who have seen this as an opportunity to advance their conservative agenda. In a way, if we read history, and then a lot of Americans are going back as Trump has become more influential, and it was a shock to us that in spite of his racism, his bigotry, his misogyny, that he didn't get a majority of votes. He became president because of peculiarity in the electoral system. But the fact that he got so many votes was deeply disturbing. And the fact that as he's lied and continued with his, I view, outrageous policies, the fact that 30% or more of Americans have continued to support him says that there's something very deeply going wrong. So this has motivated a lot of discussion in the United States about the history of fascism, studying Mussolini in Italy, Spain, and most strongly Germany. And as we study fascism, what we see is that alliance. Hitler never had more than a minority of popular support, but he got a lot of support from the business community, from conservatives, from even the moderate right. And that was what eventually led to the domination of the fascists. And so we see this in the United States today, where there are a lot of reasonable Republicans, but they've all gone quiet because they saw this as an opportunity to get some of the agenda that they wanted. They wanted to get tax cuts for the rich, for the billionaires. They wanted to get tax cuts for the corporations. There's no evidence that lowering taxes on the corporations leads to more investment and more prosperity for a country. But that wasn't really what was at issue here. What was at issue here was increasing inequality in a country which already had so much inequality. The rich wanted to use their political power to get richer. Can you believe it? In a country, I showed you these, what was happening to health statistics. Life expectancy is going down. And they passed a law that resulted in 13 million more Americans having no health insurance. Can you believe that? In a country where there's so much inequality, they passed a tax law that, when it's fully implemented, will increase taxes on a majority of those in the middle, in the majority of those in the second, third, and fourth quintiles, while lowering taxes on the billionaires. So where did all the money go? Well, we are now beginning to see where all the tax cuts for the corporations went. Did it go to more investment? No. It went to buying back shares and bigger dividends. A small amount went to wage increases, just to provide political cover for Trump. A little bit went to investment, but growth has basically stagnated. As you all know, the global financial crisis began in the United States with our financial system in 2008. Europe paid a high price for being interlinked with the United States. And finally, we passed some financial regulation. And so what is Trump trying to do? To deregulate it so we can have another big financial crisis. He's weakening environmental standards. America is the only country that is a rogue country in climate change. I think Syria and one other country had also not signed the Paris Agreement, but when U.S. dropped out, they got so embarrassed that they signed too. So now the United States is the only country, or only maybe one other country, is a rogue country and not willing to deal with the problems of climate change. So what has happened is there's this alliance of a small group of people, the Trump demagogues, but being supported by the business community and the conservatives and the moderate right, pursuing an array of policies which hurt those who voted for the demagogues. It's a total cynicism. The real danger is undermining the social cohesion and the basis of all of our progress, the idea of the Enlightenment. And I want to spend a little bit time on this because it's, I think, something that's not fully appreciated, and I think it is the real source of the danger. If you go back in time, for thousands of years, for hundreds of years, as far back as we have data, standards of living did not change at all. And then suddenly, around 1750, they started to increase. In different countries, it happened at different dates, and in emerging markets, it's finally beginning to happen. It's hard to get data going back that far, but the English have a strong proclivity for gathering data. And so you can get data for real wages of London craftsmen going back till 1200. And they show exactly the same pattern. Stagnation, basically. If you have a black plague and lots of people die, wages do go up. And you can see that in the curve there. Around 1300, 1350, wages went up. But basically, stagnation until the Enlightenment, until 1750 or 1800. And the same thing, life expectancies had been stagnant, and it's only recently that they've started to go up. And what is the basis of all these successes? Well, the basis is really the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment has two aspects to it. One is the development of science, and the other is the development of basis of social organization not dependent on authority, the rule of law, based on reason, discourse, and deliberation. And this was the real basis of the wealth of nations. It was not growth not based on the exploitation of others. It was based on the accumulation of knowledge and education. Adam Smith couldn't fully have grasped this because he was living just at the beginning of this period. He was talking about pin factories, not an innovation economy. But at the same time, Adam Smith had a lot of insights that some of the modern advocates of markets have forgotten. One of his big insights was the pursuit of self-interest leagues as if by an invisible hand to the well-being of society. But Adam Smith didn't really believe that. So one of his famous remarks, and interpreted now to talk about the need for competition policies, antitrust, people of the same trade seldom meet together, even for the merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. He had other insights. He talked about the concerted effort of employers to exploit workers. Masters are always and everywhere in a sort of tacit but constant uniform combination, not to raise the wages of labor above the actual rate. Masters, too, sometimes enter into particular combinations to sink the wages of labor even below this rate. These are always conducted with the utmost silence and secrecy. These are things that are we're very sensitive in the United States because we discovered, for instance, just recently, that Apple and Google had entered into a conspiracy to keep the wages of their workers lower. These were the wealthiest companies in the world conspiring to keep the wages of their workers down. He talked about the role of regulation. When the regulation is in support of the workman, it is always just and equitable, but is sometimes otherwise when in favor of the masters. And he talked about more than law being needed, trust and norms. If trust is too low in a society, savings will be insufficient to sustain positive output growth. So there are, in the subsequent 200 years, we've come to understand a lot more of the ideas that I've just talked about, the importance of coordination, the necessity of regulation, the necessity of collective action. One of the key explanations of the increase in inequality and the poor performance of the United States economy and that of many other advanced countries is that the rules of the game have been rewritten. Markets don't exist in a vacuum. And one of the most important functions that any society has is to write the rules of the game. And beginning under Thatcher and Reagan and continuing elsewhere in Europe, those rules of the game were rewritten in ways that actually harmed the economy and led to more inequality. They led to more short-sighted behavior as firms thought about how much money they could extract out of the corporations. As we just seen with the tax cut in the United States, they didn't use the extra money for more investment, they used it to buy back their shares. So we sometimes call this the market fundamentalist, the neoliberal view of economics and society. It's based on a particular view of markets and human nature, presumption that they are competitive, that there is little need for regulation and externalities. One of the important things I also want to emphasize is they were based on the presumption that the nature of people are fixed, preferences are fixed, and that they are unaffected by how the economy and society is structured. The reason why I emphasize that is I believe that the way the rules of the game were rewritten in America led more and more Americans to be more selfish, more greedy, and, in a sense, more immoral. It isn't just an accident that we've seen the banks in the United States do so badly. They were focused just on one thing, making money. And as they focused more and more on that, all other values went to the side. They didn't think anything wrong with trying to make money at the expense of the poorest people in society. They engaged in predatory lending. They engaged in abusive credit card practices. They engaged in market manipulation. Wells Fargo, one of the largest banks, created accounts for individuals without them knowing it, and then took money out of their accounts and charged them for the accounts that they hadn't even known that they had created. There was redistribution of money from the bottom to the top. It was moral turpitude. That's the only way you could describe it. But I would argue it was the economic system that undermined their morals, that led them to behave in that way. We've actually done some empirical studies. There's been actually some research that supports this view. One of the things, this is perhaps a little sad story, but there are studies of the degree of selfishness of economists versus other professions. And it turns out that economists are more selfish than people in other professions. And the longer they study economics, the more selfish they become. And the same thing is even more true of banking. So, So one has to try to, one of our key challenges is how to design social organization without inherited hierarchical authority. And that means it has to be based on rules, undergirded by the rule of law, based on some version of merit, recognizing human infallibility, which is why we have the systems of checks and balances. But with excessive inequalities, it's very hard to stop the power of wealth from prevailing. And that's especially true in the we see that especially in the United States, because what we have is very wealthy. They use their political power, their economic power becomes political power, and they use that to change the rules of the game, not only in the area of economics, to make the economic system more unfair, they use it to change the rules of politics so that they give the corporations and they give the wealthy people more and more power to exercise their influence. And that's the most striking case is recent Supreme Court decision where they said the corporations could give unlimited amount of money to advance their political position. But one of the things, perhaps as an academic, that I find most disturbing is the attack of Trump and the demagogues that are surrounding him on our truth-telling institutions. Social organizations can't function without some way of assessing truth, of assessing competing claims. It's necessary for deliberations over fairness, resolution of disputes, due process. And we have multiple and complementary truth-telling institutions, universities, media, judiciary, the administrative bureaucracy, the intelligence agencies. Now, many of these have not functioned perfectly, but they are all designed, in the end, to advance an assessment of truth. And Trump and his associates have been engaged in a massive attack on all of these institutions. He's talked about fake news. When he is it's been documented he lies on average 6 times a day. I mean, we couldn't believe he could keep it up for more than a year now at a pace of 6 lies a day, many of them important lies. With so many lies, people don't even, every day is a cell shock. The question is, what is going to be the lie of the day? But it's not 1 lie of the day, it's 5 lies of the day. But a society can't function if there is no sense of what is true. And so, because he knows that, he's trying to destroy all of our truth-telling institutions. This has made strange bedfellows. America's intelligence agencies, the CIA, has not always been on the right side. It was involved in the coup in Chile and Greece, and it was in the torture in Iran and in Iraq and in Afghanistan. But the interesting thing is, they've made a lot of mistakes, but they were trying to assess what was going on. That's why they call it intelligence. And there wasn't always intelligent intelligence, but that's what they were trying to do. They failed sometimes, but that's what they were trying to do. But Trump wants to destroy every element, grain of intelligence, and a society can't function. Democracy was part of the Enlightenment project. It was a particular form of social organization, a kind of collective action. I've talked about some of the principles, but it can easily be corrupted by money, and unfortunately, it is being corrupted by money in the United States. And this is really one of the main messages. Societies can wind up in 2 different equilibrium, and I think the United States is moving towards one of these equilibrium, an equilibrium with a high level of inequality, of wealth, and real no democracy. And the other equilibrium is a high level of equality, and that's the only one way you're going to get real democracy. So I hope I try to explain, give you some understanding about the rise of populism and demagoguery in the United States. It's because the economic and social system has failed large parts of America. The myths like the American dream have been undermined. Let me just mention one more, justice for all. When we were kids, still the case, kids in the United States, every morning, sort of a nationalist thing, say, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. And one of the phrases, and justice for all. But even as a kid, I knew there wasn't justice for all. I felt uneasy. But now I know how far from truth that claim is. There is justice for rich, white Americans. In the United States, there are thousands of wrongful convictions, even for murder, and disproportionately among African Americans. The United States has the system of mass incarceration. We have 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. There's been a recognition. I mean, the issue going before the court right now, Supreme Court right now, is solitary confinement cruel and unusual punishment, which is illegal? And one of the judges in the United States made a comment, well, yes, solitary confinement, if it's too long and you don't let people get outside at all for too long, is cruel and unusual. But is 2 or 3 years too long? He said he wasn't sure. In 2 or 3 years, you can break a person's mind and destroy a person. We have no system of justice in our disputes with large corporations. We have systems of private arbitration. And in the crisis in the United States, because of our legal system, people were thrown out of their homes who did not even owe any money. And in Spain, there's been some issues in foreclosure, injustice, where there is a concern about some of that going on. So to understand some of the despair, one has to understand that the stories told by the educated elites, that globalization, liberalization would benefit all, the things didn't turn out as expected. The elites were excessively confident, and they were closed to open discussion. Now the problem is that these elites, the education, enlightenment values, reasoned discourse, are being blamed for the problems by the Trump, those who haven't had the opportunity to have the education. But what Trump offers and his ilk is governance by emotions, gut feelings. It's a notion of an authoritarian, strong leader. Unbelievably, surveys show that a majority of Republicans think universities are bad things. Well, as we discuss climate change, the Enlightenment, the notion that science tells us that climate change is not believed. The Enlightenment has to be relitigated every day. The reason this is so important is it's an attack on the most fundamental values of tolerance, most fundamental values of knowledge, all of which are the basic underpinnings of social and economic progress. So that's why I feel very strongly that Trump and similar demagogues represent such a threat to our economic and political system and to the Enlightenment project, which has underlay advances in the economy in the past 200 years. The irony, of course, is some of you may know that Trump says, oh, I'm a businessman. I know how to run the economy. Well, he's not really a businessman. He's a scammer. In economics, we say there's 2 ways of making wealth, becoming wealthy. One is to create value, to innovate, to do something real. The other one is to take money away from others. You can become wealthy doing that, but that's a redistribution. It's not real wealth. And if you look at how Trump made his money, it was on that kind of what we call rent-seeking. Money laundering, Trump University, exploitation of bankruptcy laws, weaknesses in our legal system, taking advantage of political influence to get zoning changes. It's the whole gamut. It wasn't based on wealth creation. And the unfortunate thing is, many of the people around him that he's appointed are also all rent seekers. There's not a single person who is a wealth creator in his economic team. And that is a different mindset between a wealth creator and a rent seeker. And as I try to emphasize, this is so different from the real basis of the wealth of nations. At the same time as he engages in that exploitation, he's bringing out the baser elements, changing who we are as individuals and how our society functions. I won't go through all the points, reiterate all the points I've made, but I want to say the bottom line of all this is there is an alternative agenda, which is the progressive reform agenda based on promoting a shared prosperity. So the real danger of the demagogues is that it undermines the basis of our civilization. The most serious threat is to our epistemology, to the rule of law, the premises on which our democracy and our economy rest. He's sown doubt about both well-established truths and our truth-telling institutions. And I want to try to give a sense that it is easy to sow doubt. That's one of the advances unfortunately, in modern psychology, modern behavioral economics. The cigarette companies showed how this could be done. When science showed that smoking was dangerous to your health, it caused all kinds of disease, cancer, heart disease, lung disease. The cigarette companies engaged in a massive campaign to sow doubt, to say, well, maybe there was some scientific doubt. In their own research, they knew that that was not true. Their own research showed that their cigarettes were killing people. But that didn't bother them. They were interested in money, greed above all else. And so they had this massive, successful campaign to convince Americans and people all over the world that smoking was not dangerous to your health. Or at least there was skepticism about the science. But if you can convince people about cigarettes being safe, you can convince people that bad ideas are also safe. And the ideas of neoliberalism are unsafe ideas. And the ideas that have led to, the Reagan-Thatcher ideas are ideas that have led to slower growth and more inequality. And the Trump ideas are even more dangerous. The damage of Trump will be long-lasting. We are just beginning to see its corrosive effects. So in terms of remedies, these are the problems I've talked about are not inherent in the capitalist system. As I said before, we need to rewrite the rules of the economy once again. We need to rewrite the rules of democracy to take out the influence of money. We need a more active policies of redistribution, more access to education, redistribution of wealth, because only then will we have a real system of checks and balances. We need to get a better balance in our society between the market, state, and the community. And when I say the community, too often we think of there are only two kinds of organization, markets and government. But there are lots of other forms of organization, cooperatives. There are lots of forms, we call it the third way. There are lots of other ways engaging society. We have to have a better balance between different forms of organization, between the present and the future, between man and nature. Remembering the design of our social, political, and economic institutions shapes who we are. And unfortunately, the episode that we've been through the last 30 or 40 years has been shaping, I think, our societies in ways I think that we probably are not good. Market fundamentalism, neoliberalism has lost the balance. So to me, and the reason I maybe have spoken a little bit too long and maybe somewhat passionately for an academic, is this is a war. It's not a war with guns, but it's a war of ideas. But the consequences are as fundamental as one could be talking about. And so that's why I say we can win this war, but only if we understand the magnitude of the attack that it represents on our entire civilization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you sit in the middle, please?
Okay.
Better, yeah. We thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Stiglitz, for your presentation. We're happy to see there is some hope, at least at the end of the tunnel. Now it's time for questions and your answers, but we need the other person. That is Javier Larrañaga. He is the deputy or minister, we could say, of the government of Gipuzkoa, of taxes and finance. Javier Larrañaga, jauna, ongi etorri. Hango isarlekoan eseri, mesedez. Han, mesedez, importaz pasaizu, bai, zenik hemen erlojua daukat. Bueno, dakizuenez, oraindik galderak egiteko aukera daukazue eta eskertzen dizuegu benetan hainbat galdera egitea. 30 minutu dauzkagu bakarrik, baina bueno, gero koktelean ere Stiglitz jaunari galdetzeko aukera izango dugu. Javier Larrañaga jauna, zer Stiglitz jaunari entzun diozu eta nola laburbilduko zenuke edo ze ideia nagusierekin gelditu zara bere hitzaldiari buruz? Eta noski, berari egindako lehenengo galdera zurea izango da.
Bueno, lehenik eta behin eskarrik asko danoi, eskarrik asko etorri zaten danoi, eta nola ez, eskarrik asko Stiglitz jaunai. Bueno, hemen ez da erraza, ez? Kasu honetan ide hau edanak pixkat sintetizatzen bi gauzakin gehatu naiz lantzeko. Bat da desigualdaden inguruen, ezberdintasunan inguruen, eta bestie da demagogian inguruen. Orduan, bueno, hemen Stiglitz jaunak esan du, traduzio badauka?
Yeah. Do you need any translation?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
You don't know any Basque for the moment, right? Bai, belarritakoa, itzulpena behar du Stiglitz jaunak, beraz norbaitek ekarri aldion itzulpena egiteko aurikularra. I don't know if we can continue in English or you prefer to speak.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because
So I was saying that
prestago.
the third one.
Bai, igual hasi hitz egiten.
Wait.
The third one.
Number 3. Number 3.
Okay. Yeah.
Good.
Oso ondo. Bueno, esaten nahi nitzena zen, bi puntutan nik uste dut, mezu ez egon bat desberdintasunan inguruen eta bestie demagogian inguruen. Ezberdintasunien, Gipuzku, zorionez maila honien gaude, indize ezberdinan arabera neurtzen bagea, nordikotatik gertu gaude, beraz, abia puntu bezala interesantia da, abia puntu bezala bentaja bat izan leke, baina munduko korrontetatik, obviamente ez gaude aparte, bai? Eta gaina, Stiglitz jaunak esan duen bezala, desberdintasunak geota efizienteo da, ez? Beraz, ezberdintasuna baldin bada baitare, gure politikan ondorio, eta guk eiten deunan ondorio, gaurko egunien zier, aukera izan deu, pixkat gure bizilue, gure modelue esplikatzeko, konpartitzeko, oso zentrauta balore kolaboratibotan, oso zentrauta gizarte politika egiteko moduen, hirugarren sektore baten apoiauta, hau da, kolaborazioko eskema importante baten. Nire galderatako bat, galdera askotako bat, ez originala eta ez inteligentie, baina preokupazio baten puntu bezala, da, Gipuzkoa bezalako edo Euskal Herri bezalako lurralde txiki baten korronte handi hauekin, guk pixkat mai gainean jarritako politika hauek ze arrisku, ikusten ditun, zerri behira hon bergenduke, zerri atento hon bergenduke, porque azkenengo partien esan du baitare, hau gerra badala, eta oso importantia dela atake hori ondo ulertzia. Beraz, gu bezalako lurralde txiki baten, horrelako mundu mailako movimentu baten, zerrei behira egon berko genduke, gure politika hauek benetan efektibo izateko. Zerrei atento egon berko genduke, gure politika hauei erasan leiken gauzatan.
So I think there are probably two things that I would focus on. One is the danger of bad ideas coming from outside. That people will tell you you have to lower your taxes if you're going to grow. I once asked the finance minister of Sweden why Sweden was so successful, and he said, because we have high taxes. Now, he didn't mean that taxes were good things, but what he meant was that you have to be able to provide education, health, infrastructure, and that takes resources. It doesn't come for free. And so if you're going to get all those things, you have to pay for them, and the only way to do that is through taxes and fees of some kind. So that's one important message to realize that those who are telling you join the race to the bottom to lower your taxes, that's not going to work. That's going to wind up everybody being at the bottom. The second thing is that you have some big advantages being small. One of the advantages of being small is that you can achieve greater cohesiveness than in a large country. In a very large country like the United States with a lot of inequality, we are becoming more and more economically segregated, with rich people living with rich people, poor people with poor people, and they don't know each other. Mm-hmm. So there's no basis of social understanding. Mm-hmm. And that helps create a more divided society. Mm-hmm. But another advantage of being small is that in the global economy, there are always going to be changes. And China is moving up the value added. It's going into, for instance, more and more, it began with labor intensive apparel, and now it's moving into machines. So it's becoming competitive at different levels. That's going to require adjustment. But when you're small, you only have to find a relatively few niches, a few places where you have strength, and that can enable you to adapt to this ever-changing environment.
Well, now that you have been talking about the chances of being small, actually one of the questions that had the bigger amount of votes, of likes, is talking about nationalisms. And, well, you know what's going on in Catalonia. Actually, there is a lot of people here who believe in that it could be good to become another state. This person is asking, do you think nationalism is a compatible ideology with the building of, with the construction of a state with equality of people?
Yeah, so let me try to distinguish between Trump's nationalism, which I view as we sometimes call it nativism. It's looking inward, trying to blame others for your problems, and closing your mind to others. And for instance, another kind of nationalism that is much more tempered, like in Scotland. You know, so they had a big debate about Scottish independence. But when they were talking about independence, at the same time, they were arguing that they wanted to be more open. They wanted to be part of Europe. They were going so far as they wanted to invite anybody from anywhere in the world to come to their universities and live in Scotland. So it was not closing their minds, but it was trying to say, what is Scottish identity, Scottish culture? And, you know, so they were making a lot of discussion that at a time when the UK was raising tuition at the universities, they were making their universities free. So they were saying, well, we have different values about education than England.
But is it possible and realistic to have a small state in a global world?
Well, yeah, I think it is possible when...
Would it work?
When there are global rules that are working. So by that I mean, in a world where we were, before Trump, we were trying to create a world where borders mattered less and less. So goods could move, people could move, and then the issue was, in that kind of a world, you could have small groups of people decide on their own education systems, their own healthcare systems, but then at the same time that they were small and cohesive, they were also part of a bigger community. And they could be part of many bigger communities. They could be part of Europe, they could be part of the world, okay? Well, Trump has actually undermined that kind of conception because he says he doesn't want to have any global rules. So I think what seemed to be something that was more possible 5 years ago is becoming at least more questioned, because you have to have somebody to stand up to a country like the United States that is a rogue country, that doesn't want to deal with climate change, that doesn't want to deal, wants to have their own rules of the game about trade. So a world in which you have one big country and lots of small countries, each independent, it's not going to be a world that works. So we're going to need a complex set of political institutions. So the question will be, what degrees of autonomy, what degrees of delegation, and what degrees of coordination? So Europe, the EU, has this important principle of subsidiarity, of devolving powers to the lower union, and the same thing ought to be true within countries. Where, you know, how you redefine these issues now in the era of Trump, I think, is something that is going to have to be discussed once again.
Yes, well, raising taxes while we are looking for niches was enough for me. I mean, it was just a good message for me. So I could finish here, but anyway, talking about, hablando de demagogia, hablando de demagogia, sí, hablando de demagogia, sí vemos, o sí tenemos el reto de acercar la sociedad y la política, es decir, ese mismo modelo colaborativo. Bueno, pues estamos también desarrollando una gobernanza colaborativa donde podamos crear, de hecho estamos creando espacios, estamos creando programas. Bueno, etorkizuna eraikiz también es un modelo de creación de futuro colaborativo. Puede ser una vacuna o puede ser una vacuna, diría yo, para la demagogia, el tratar de acercar, es decir, eso que hoy en día es tan difícil, acercar sociedad y política, crear espacios, puede ser una vacuna y hay países que están desarrollando cosas en ese sentido.
Yeah, I think it is an important part of, I don't know if it's strong enough to call it a vaccine, but one of the sources of the support for Trump is the feeling, I said, the sense of powerlessness, that their voice is not being heard.
Sure, yeah.
And the leaks didn't care about them. You know, I try to go visit various parts of the country because New York is a little bit of a island, and Manhattan is an island. So I go to Kentucky and to North Carolina and to Virginia and these. And one of the stories, you have discussions. You say, don't you understand that Trump is going to make your life worse? He's going to take away health care, which he did. He's not going to bring you back jobs. It's going to be empty promises. And the answer is, we don't care. We don't expect government to help us. All we want is somebody to listen to us.
Okay.
And it was a little bit of a cry of despair. The fact, and this went a little bit to the way the political campaign in 2016 was conducted. Trump went to Kentucky many times, went to these places. And the very fact he went there was a statement that he cared for them. Where Hillary Clinton did not go to many of these places because her calculus said, you're going to lose these stakes, so don't use your resources. But to them, that was a message that she didn't care. And then they talked to people in other states. And so the message got across that she didn't care about these workers, the people I described before, who were not doing so well. So that's why I think what you described of trying to bring them in and listen and have more engagement is absolutely critical.
Now that we have been talking about inequalities for more than an hour, what are your thoughts on universal and conditional basic income? Do you support such policy?
I think that it can be an important bridge. But when I say a bridge, it seems to me that our society has a responsibility to provide jobs for everybody who is willing and wants it to work. And the idea that you say to somebody, don't worry if there's no jobs, we'll write you a check, is not the basis of a good society. And so it seems to me that it's not a substitute for the basic obligation of society to create an economy that can create enough jobs that everybody who wants one can work. Now, my children tell me that this is very old thinking.
The culture of effort?
Because, so I say, work is part of dignity, And they tell me, no, they can have dignity without work, that they have spiritual values, and that they, but I'm still not convinced. So I still am of the view that work is important. And maybe in the future we'll have to revisit this issue. But for now, I think that UBI should only be viewed as a stopgap until we get the jobs. But our primary obligation should be the jobs.
Many people are asking and supporting this question. Well, you already talked about Mondragon as the cooperative movement. They ask, are you or do you think it's good that the workers, like in cooperatives, are part of the company?
Yes, I mean, I think cooperative movement, including workers being part of the decision-making process, you still need technical expertise, but that the cooperative decision-making process is of value. There have been a number of studies of that the cooperatives are better able to have long-term plans. They're thinking not just about the next quarterly return in the way that most American companies are. They're thinking about their job not just for the next quarter, but for their years to come. They make the long-term investments. America has not been making those long-term investments. And they managed, in the United States, there were a lot of studies about how the cooperatives responded to the 2008 crisis. And whereas a lot of companies just fired workers, they didn't care, there was no loyalty. They treated workers as if they were disposable. Yes, thank you for working for us, but now we don't need you, go away. And the cooperatives were much more stable. And therefore, that provided, you might say, more human capital going forward. So there are a number of economic arguments why cooperatives are a better way, at least in many areas of economic organization. Let me give you one more example. One of the cooperatives forms that is relative in the United States are the credit unions, which are like cooperative banks. They were not engaged in the kind of bad behavior that was pervasive in America's financial system. They were almost the only example of where you didn't see the kinds of bad behavior that you saw in almost all the other banks, but particularly the big banks. Now, I'm a little bit prejudiced towards co-op. I live in a co-op. In New York, most of the housing in Manhattan is cooperatives, are co-ops. And my publisher is a co-op. Of the editors, but when the original owner got old and said, how do we keep the company going? He said, well, I don't want to sell it to somebody who will just be interested in money. I'm interested in ideas, and I'm interested in making sure ideas disseminate, that good authors get published, even if nobody reads them. And so he said, let's make it a co-op.
Well,
and he converted it to a cooperative.
You really believe in it, for sure. Another question is asking, how can we live with the fear of, like when someone like Merkel or Macron, the president of France, they take decisions and they affect to businesses here in Gipuzkoa?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of globalization, that what goes on in one part of the world affects people in other parts of the world. So that's one of the reasons why it's important to have rules, global rules and EU rules that are collectively decided, that make sure that those effects are mostly positive and that there are limits to the negative effects. And that's why I've argued you need important regulations to stop the negative effects. But you talked about cooperation, governance, and the same thing is true in the EU. There has to be, I think there's probably excessive power in a couple, in Germany particularly, and I think in the management of the euro crisis, it was a disaster, quite frankly. Its particular view of the economy is not a view shared by most economists in the world. And their view about austerity, we feel strongly in the United States about it because Herbert Hoover was the president of the United States in 1929, and he used austerity to convert the stock market crash of -- into the Great Depression. I don't want to. So austerity has a long record of failure. And it failed. The IMF tried it in East Asia and Argentina. And why Germany tried it in Spain and Greece, it failed. And it was Germany using its economic power to affect economic policies in other countries, in a very non-democratic way, I think. So I think the EU has to really try to reconstitute itself in a way to prevent those kinds of abuse of power.
Yeah, well, now that you are talking about reconstitution of the EU, my next question, coming from someone from the audience, is asking actually about the draft. This is the latest news in Italy. The draft to create the new government that is talking about leaving the Eurozone. So is there populism and demagogy in that statement or in that proposal, or real economics?
Well, I've written a book called The Euro, in which I argued that the way the euro was constructed made it very difficult for there to be shared prosperity across the region, across Europe. When you had a shock in one part of the region, you took away the mechanisms of adjustment, exchange rate and interest rates, and you didn't put anything in its place. The United States has a single currency over 50 very differing stakes, not as different as the Eurozone, but still quite differing stakes. But we have a much stronger fiscal policy. When one state is weak, we can help it. We have a common banking union, including common deposit insurance. If the United States did not have common deposit insurance, we would have had a financial crisis that was 100 times worse than what we did. We have common unemployment insurance. So when California has a high unemployment rate, the whole country supports it. So these are some of the institutions that Europe needs if it's going to work. It's not hard. And many of the things, if you talk, even Germany has agreed about the principle of a common deposit insurance. But the response is, not now, not yet. But the point is, I think it's urgent because there's going to be another shock. You know that. You don't know when, but there will be a shock. And if you don't have these mechanisms in place, somebody is going to suffer. So coming back to Italy, I think from what I spent some time in Italy, I think there is a real sense of grievance in Italy. they can't complain as strongly as Spain can complain, or even Greece is the strongest grievance. But there is a strong sentiment that the shackles that the euro has imposed, including the growth and stability framework, which is more accurately described as the non-growth and instability framework, that has to change. And so I'm sure it's partly bargaining, but I hope, and I think there is a moment now where that bargaining may be successful, because I think Macron also agrees that the change has to be. And if there are enough countries in Europe, I think that momentum will shift, and particularly, you know, the possibility of Italy moving out in one way or another is a significant threat. They may not leave. They're talking also about setting up what is equivalent to a dual currency, which would be violating the rules. But their view is, we'll violate the rules, but Europe surely won't throw us out.
Are you worried about robots putting out persons at work?
I think that robots are going to be a challenge in many industries. But if our society adapts, has the right tax policies, including maybe taxing robots, then it shouldn't be. And let me explain two reasons why. First, if you tax workers, workers might not work. If you tax robots, they can't go on strike. So there's a basis of taxes and changing the rules of intellectual property, which mean that you can, the basic idea is that robots are supposed to increase productivity, right? Make us richer. But if you're richer, if you take some of the extra wealth and redeploy it, everybody could, in principle, be better off. The problem is that may not happen. So that's a political issue. It's a question of policy, how we manage robotization, just like how we manage globalization.
Again, regulation.
Regulation and government programs. So one of the big problems that will be facing Spain, facing all countries, is an aging population. Much of the care of aging can't be robotized. Some of it can, but most of it can't be. So if we could tax, say, the robots to hire people, to pay people more for being teachers, for being doctors, for carrying the elderly, then we move towards more of a service sector economy. If you support more R&D and more increased productivity. So if you can take the benefits of productivity and redeploy them, then everybody in our society can be better off.
There will be place for everybody, including robots. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we don't have more time left, but there is a cocktail now. I hope you will be there, because for sure people who didn't get the answers to their questions, maybe they will come to you. Thank you very much. Stiglitz jaunari esan diodan moduan, orain koktela daukazue, os invitamos a ir al cóctel donde por supuesto podremos seguir charlando. Le damos las gracias también a la Diputación de Guipúzcoa, al Colegio Vasco de Economistas, por haber organizado estas charlas con las que hemos podido traer al Nobel de Economía. Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with us. And hurrengo arte, eskerrik asko zuei ere hemen izateagatik.